What you are about to hear is not a podcast. This is a global conversation recorded live in real time with real people.
Journalists,
business leaders,
academics, politicians. I think the terms deep state. Oh dear.
Investors,
experts, diplomats,
citizens.
Coming together from around the world to share their views and ask our guests the questions. If you would like to join this conversation or hear our incredible library of past conversations, please visit our website, pm101.club, and join the fastest growing conscious community on the free internet. Thanks for being here.
Enjoy the
show. Hey everyone, welcome back to Politics and Media 101. I'm Jeff Browning, and if you listen to our first few episodes, then you know that over the last few months, my friend Justin Higgins and I and our friends have convened hundreds of conversations, sometimes more than once per day, with up to 30,000 live listeners and participants, where we hear live and direct from people who are in the news, in their own voices, in their own words, in long form, and where anyone who wants to can join to ask them a question, share their thoughts, or just listen. We're just now starting to release recorded portions of our live conversations for the first time, and we're grateful to you for joining us. In our last episode, we spoke with Republican Congressman Peter Meijer about Afghanistan, and in this episode, we continue that discussion with Dr. Seth Jones of the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Dr. Jones knows a lot not only about Afghanistan, its history, and recent events there, but also about U.S. decision-making, who decided to do what and when, over the course of the United States' nearly 2 decades there. On the day we spoke with Dr. Jones, President Biden had just given a speech, the U.S. was in its final stages of withdrawal, and many were starting to ask questions about the future of Afghanistan. Now U.S. forces are gone and the Taliban is back in power, what will life be like for Afghans? How will the U.S. withdrawal reshape balances of power in the region? And very importantly, what will happen to all the people who helped the U.S., for example, as interpreters and translators, but who weren't able to get out? With the Taliban targeting them, what can be done to help, and what will happen to those Afghan allies? It was a great conversation. We had incredible audience questions, and we hope you enjoy it. As always, if you like or dislike what you hear, if you want to find out how to join us live almost every day of the week, maybe ask one of our upcoming guests a question, or hear past episodes, please visit our website, pm101.live or pm101.club. They both work and will get you to the same place where you can find all that and more. Without any further ado, let's roll the tape.
President Biden gave a speech today after coming under fire from media outlets across the spectrum for being absent during the fall of Afghanistan. What were your thoughts and opinions of the speech that you heard?
Well, I think it was a defense by the president of the decision that he had made to withdraw all U.S. forces from Afghanistan. It was a continuation, really, of what he's been saying for the last several months, which is, in his view, the costs of staying and the benefits, any of the benefits of staying don't add up, so that there are just too many costs, and the benefits of staying in Afghanistan are far too little. They didn't want to continue to sacrifice American forces for yet a fifth president, he said, and going into now the third decade of the war in Afghanistan. I think the challenge that he still has faced is there are at least two from the speech. One is just the sheer challenges and the messiness of the withdrawal. The scenes and imagery of individuals at the Kabul airport, where I have been, probably like many of those participants here, numerous times. It's been sheer panic. So it's led to lots of questions about why was the U.S. not better prepared for the withdrawal? Why was the U.S. not better prepared to foresee the rapid collapse of Afghan national security forces? I've got my own view on that, and happy to go through that. And then more broadly, there really wasn't a clear cost-benefit calculations of keeping a very small presence in Afghanistan, which is what the U.S. has right now, Virtually no U.S. forces have died, certainly not recently. The U.S. has not been doing the bulk of the fighting. It's been the Afghans. And so if you look at the cost-benefit calculations of preserving the Afghan government now, or the costs of the collapse, and I mean, just to look at the Taliban regime that is now governing the country in most of the major cities, its track record is pretty clear cut. It's not democratic. It rules by Sharia or Islamic law. Its leaders are not elected. They essentially believe that they have the authority under God to serve the country. The history of repression of women and of human rights more broadly is systematic, and it's deeply concerning. And then, as U.S. intelligence assessments have consistently argued, it is a stunning UN report that came out in June of 2021, highlighted repeatedly, and several UN reports have said this categorically. The Taliban continues to have close relationships at the strategic, operational, and tactical levels with al-Qaeda in the country today. In fact, the June 2021 UN report highlighted over 10,000 foreign fighters in Afghanistan, including Islamic State and several major organizations that have been involved in terrorist activity in the region, Lashkar-e-Taiba, the Tehrik-i-Taliban Pakistan or Pakistan Taliban, Jaish-e-Mohammed, and a number of others. So there are serious risks of a resurgence of terrorism. I spoke to folks today at several humanitarian organizations, including at the UN and Refugees International, that are deeply concerned about a humanitarian catastrophe in Afghanistan. And I think that's not something that the president really got into, is the trade-offs now in what is an acute humanitarian crisis and a major terrorism problem that's on the horizon. And I would say the last comment along these lines, just in trade-offs, is there's an interesting meeting and a photograph from about 2.5 weeks ago. One of the senior Taliban leaders, Mullah Baradar, was in China for meetings with senior Chinese leaders, including a photograph with the Chinese foreign minister. And it was clear at that meeting that the Chinese supported the Taliban. The Russians, we know, because there have been leaked intelligence, particularly from the Russian support from the GRU, the military intelligence, the main directorate. Iranians, especially the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Quds Force, and Pakistan, which has been the primary supporter of the Taliban. All of these countries have provided combinations of diplomatic, intelligence, and military support. So, if you're looking at trade-offs as well, now you've got all of the U.S.'s major adversaries moving into Afghanistan. We can argue about whether that's a good or a bad thing, but I think what's been missing is a real serious public acknowledgement that there are definitely some costs and benefits about the withdrawal. And we've heard a lot about the benefits of withdrawal, but as we've seen in the last few days, there are some enormous costs of the withdrawal as well. So I think those are all worth understanding and thinking through, and everybody's cost benefit calculations are going to be slightly different. But I think this is a serious issue. This is not a clear-cut one.
No, it is not, and we will get into a lot of what you just outlined, and we will get into what's going on right now and also what we can expect in the future. But I do just want to kind of go into what we were told by President Biden as recent as July 8th. He gave a speech and basically said that the Taliban is not the North Vietnamese army. We will not see images like we saw out of Vietnam in 1975. And he was very adamant that Kabul may never fall. So I'm just wondering, can you explain the worst case scenario? We were hearing 6 months. Kabul may stay up for 6 months in the worst case scenario from U.S. advisors. So was Joe Biden lying to us? Was this a failure in Secretary Austin and Joe Biden's planning to get us out? Was it a failure of intelligence, like you're now hearing Joe Biden's people leak to the media? Don't blame them, blame the IC. Or was it a little bit of all the above?
These are good questions. We probably won't know all of the answers until intelligence assessments are declassified eventually. But my conversations with folks in the U.S. government, including in the intelligence community over the past couple of days, suggest a few things. One is, I think it's pretty clear that when you look at the words that President Biden said about that the confidence he had that the government would not fall, the confidence that he had that this was not Vietnam, this is not the fall of Saigon. He was not right. He was wrong about those predictions, and those were not long ago. So I think he was wrong on that. I'm also told that there were intelligence assessments that indicated U.S. assessments that indicated that if the administration continued a complete withdrawal of U.S. military forces from Afghanistan and refused to provide any kind of combat support or other assistance to Afghan forces fighting the Taliban in cities like Kandahar and Lashkar-Gah, that the government would potentially fall within a month. They were slightly wrong in the sense that the collapse happened even quicker, more like 2 weeks. So, but I think that, my general discussions with folks in the U.S. intelligence community and then in other areas of the government, U.S. government, were that the intelligence community assessments were quite bleak. I think where there were that many people, both inside and outside the government, didn't fully appreciate the speed with which Afghan forces would stand down. And I think there are a couple of things worth noting. One is that Afghan forces were not defeated on the battlefield. This is not how Kabul fell, nor how Afghanistan was overrun by the Taliban. There were not large pitched battles in multiple cities, heavy fighting by very well trained, equipped forces, many of whom I have worked with over the years. Instead, what happened was that most Afghan units laid down their weapons and negotiated surrender deals. In some cases, also took payments to surrender. What my conversations with Afghan officials over the last several days suggested was that there were several serious issues that they had to grapple with. One was it was very clear that the U.S. was leaving, but also clear that the U.S. was not going to provide any kind of military support during the fight. And the last element, which is potentially the most important, is over the last several weeks and months, it was also clear that the Taliban had the support of virtually every major government in the region, probably with the exception of India. The Russians were providing support to the Taliban. Pakistan definitely was. That's where the Taliban's leadership structure has largely been since 2001 in Pakistan, with support from Pakistan's intelligence service, the ISI. One of the Taliban's major shuras, regional shuras, sits in Iran. So Iran has provided some assistance. And then the Chinese have provided significant assistance, including with the public support to one of the Taliban's senior leaders, Mullah Baradar, just 2.5 weeks ago. So I think the Afghan military's decision to lay down its weapons and not fight this out was that they had lost U.S. and European military support. Virtually every major government in the region, including the major powers like the Russians and the Chinese, backed the Taliban, that the die was cast, that they had very little, if any, chance of winning a war. So it made a lot more sense to lay down arms. This then means that it was not the training, the equipping, or much of the U.S. assistance that's been provided, but the decision to withdraw and the support that the Taliban was able to get from governments in the region. I think that has been an underreported development that crippled the Afghan National Security Forces and triggered what was, in my view, one of the most stunning developments over the past couple of days, which is really the lack of fighting that contributed to the collapse.
Dr. Jones, this is one of the most important things to me, along with the potential loss of human rights that you already touched on. But the U.S. promised roughly 88,000 Afghan partners. Think of, for everybody in the audience, translators who walked around with our State Department officials and military officials over the last 2 decades, guides helping us understand terrain that maybe wasn't on maps, other partners that helped keep United States armed forces safe, alive, and well to the best of their ability. They also risked their life knowing that they were going against the Taliban. And in exchange for helping us out, we promised them that we would bring them to safety when the time came. Joe Biden had 7 months to bring people home. He was able to bring home less than 2,000 of these people. So I guess during that time, what happened here? Why weren't they brought home? Why weren't we had Seth Moulton on? He was calling for the administration to use emergency powers. What are you hearing from people in D.C.? Why are we putting these 88,000 people at risk?
I think there was insufficient planning to and an insufficient priority to get these individuals out of Afghanistan. These are individuals that had fought, in some cases, severely wounded. I mean, some died fighting with the United States or serving in with U.S. diplomats or U.S. intelligence officials or with U.S. Development agencies. I think more broadly too, the numbers are even larger because many Afghans, millions of them across cities like Herat and Tarankot and Kandahar and Kunduz and Mazar-e-Sharif and of course Kabul itself and Jalalabad and numerous other cities believed that they would have a different life. They would have the opportunity to educate their children, including their girls, that women would have an opportunity to work, that they'd have an opportunity to come out of the oppression of the Taliban regime of the 1990s, and that individuals, including women, would be allowed to dress as they saw fit, wouldn't have to wear the burqa or grow their hair out to a specific length that the Taliban mandated. And they turned out to that hope turned out to be fleeting. So I think there was poor planning in getting out those individuals that helped U.S. military soldiers, including me, those and DoD civilians, those intelligence, State Department diplomats, development agency workers, and then there's just the broader tragedy of Afghans that had a new hope in life. Now the country has reverted back to, sadly, the dark ages. I mean, like the 700s in just the treatment of women, the oppression of individuals. It's a real sad statement for the society writ large.
Dr. Jones, I want to follow up on this question. Are we going to be able to get these people out? And if we can't get them out, because right now it appears to me you have all these connections in special forces and intelligence, but looking at Clarissa Ward on CNN, it appears to me that the U.S. military and special forces are essentially in a circle just trying to keep hold of the Kabul airport. How are we going to try and get these people out that are probably dispersed throughout the country? And if we can't get them out, what's going to happen to them?
I just don't see any way that the U.S. military and other U.S. agencies are going to get all of these individuals out. They're under extraordinary danger. Anybody that served with the U.S. military, supported the U.S. government, supported other NATO and ISAF governments operating in Afghanistan, essentially for the Taliban, supported the enemy. So they're under extraordinary danger of being assassinated. And the Taliban has done just this for the past not just 20 years since the overthrow of their regime in late 2001, but while they ran Afghanistan over the course of the 1990s. They executed individuals they considered spies. They executed individuals that had contacts in many cases with Westerners. So I think anybody that aided in any way, shape, or form the U.S., and that information is identified based on viewing their cell phones and contacts, human reporting, other kinds of reporting that Taliban intelligence agents are able to identify. These individuals are under extraordinary danger. So if they're not able to get out of Afghanistan, either because the U.S. military is able to get them out, or they flee to neighboring countries like Pakistan, or get out through Central Asia and into Europe or Turkey or other locations, there is a serious concern that they and some of their family members are going to be killed. And I think that's the reality that that those Afghans face in the country.
And you've touched upon this a little bit earlier. You said the Taliban is a 7th century organization with regards to human rights. If you are a normal working class woman or a girl 8-10 years old that wants to go to school, you've grown up last 2 decades, relative freedom, the ability to go to school. Now that the Taliban has taken over, what does this actually mean for the working class, the normal people in Afghanistan that are just trying to live their life and give their kids a better future than what they grew up with?
Well, what the Taliban has said recently about education and in areas that they've controlled in Afghanistan over the last few years, what they've demonstrated in practice is that they will allow education, including for girls. It's just a strict version of Islam, their interpretation of Hanafi Sunni Islam, so that what girls will get educated is not in math, science, language. It's in very, very narrow, strict, extremist interpretation of Islam. So what we should not expect, and what the Taliban's practices have indicated, is that girls are not going to get any kind of education that will allow them to be able to read, do basic math, any of that. That's gone. In addition, we can expect a serious change in what and how women can work, what jobs they can have, how they're treated in general. Women under Taliban rule that have been raped have often been, or even those that have been involved in terrible situations with husbands that may have multiple wives, and they've tried to get out of those marriages, have been stoned, or had limbs chopped off, or in some cases been executed. So it's a real serious threat to any of the progress. It's also been actually quite interesting to see in Afghanistan's parliament that there have been women members. That we can expect to see end as well. So female participation in executive, legislative, and certainly judicial branches, because the Taliban court systems will not allow women to serve in any court functions. All of this is gone, and the Taliban continues to have a ruthless interpretation of their version of Islam, and draconian punishments enacted by their Ministry of Virtue and Vice for anybody that listens to Western music or dresses in Western style or doesn't grow their hair out in ways that reflect Taliban views of dressing. All these kinds of daily occurrences are likely to impact Afghans in cities now like Kabul, where they've seen significant changes. All this, I fear the worst now.
How will a resurgent Taliban government impact the region? And I know this is a loaded question, but I'm thinking specifically stability in Pakistan, which it seems like they were funding the Taliban and they really wanted this to happen. I'm thinking Iran, and I'm thinking China, which you have already mentioned.
Well, I think one of the most concerning elements of the rise, the resurgence of the Taliban is, and we've talked about the humanitarian implications. Speaking to folks from the UN today, they're expecting mass refugees, not just internally displaced persons, but refugees. Afghans right now are the third largest refugee population in the world behind Syria and Venezuela. And I think we should expect them to surge to number 2 and potentially number 1. And what that means for neighboring countries is refugees headed into Pakistan as they did in the 1990s, and potentially Iran, and certainly also north into Central Asia. We will also expect, we heard this today from European leaders in Germany and France and other countries, that they're bracing now for large numbers of refugees attempting to get to Europe. I think what we can also see is some concern from countries in the region about the spread of terrorist organizations. Afghanistan now has, this is outside of the Taliban, about 10,000, more than 10,000 foreign fighters, according to recent UN estimates, which include Al-Qaeda, the Islamic State, Lashkar-e-Taiba, other Pakistan militant groups, as well as some Uzbek groups, the Islamic Movement of Uzbekistan, potentially some Uyghur extremist organizations from the Xinjiang province of China. So I think there's a very serious question about Afghanistan surging as a sanctuary for terrorist organizations operating in the region. And this has been a struggle for Pakistan over the past several decades, that its intelligence service, the ISI, has had longstanding relations with the Taliban. It's also had longstanding relationships with other groups, including the TTP, the Tehrik-i-Taliban Pakistan, or Pakistan Taliban. And the challenge that the ISI, Pakistan's intelligence service, has had is that it can never entirely control the organizations that it works with. So there is often blowback. Pakistan suffered this after 9/11 with attacks in cities across Pakistan from groups that it had negotiated deals with. So I think there's a very serious question about to what degree Pakistan can control or at least influence a Taliban that has ties to militant groups operating in the region. And Indian officials that I've spoken to over the last couple of weeks have expressed particular concern about the rise of anti-Indian groups operating from Afghan soil. So I think if you're looking at countries in the region, they need to expect a flood of refugees into their countries. They also need to be prepared for a resurgence of terrorist activity from groups operating in multiple countries in the region. And I think this will be quite a destabilizing situation, and one that I don't think any country in the region is particularly well prepared for.
Dr. Jones, this is a tough one. But looking back at this period in U.S. foreign policy, I mean the last 2 decades, I mean Libya, I mean Iraq, I mean Afghanistan, I mean so on and so forth. What should we learn? And are you confident that policymakers will actually learn anything from what's going on right now?
I think one thing that we can learn, and I think there has been some progress among U.S. policymakers, is that the U.S. cannot socially engineer countries. That I think it was inevitable, almost certainly inevitable, based on the U.S. public's reaction after 9/11, that the U.S. was going to get involved in Afghanistan and to send forces. And remember, by late 2001, after the 9/11 attacks, which killed the largest number of Americans by terrorism in the history of the country, that the U.S. successfully overthrew the Taliban in a matter of weeks with barely 100 CIA paramilitary officers and some special operations forces. And so by late 2001, it was actually a relatively successful situation. Over the next decade in particular, the U.S. did send large numbers of conventional forces, over 100,000, both conventional and special operations forces, to essentially win the war for Afghans. And, I was among many others that was in Afghanistan with the U.S. military, trying to do that. I think in retrospect, it was a mistake to believe that the U.S. ever could win a war for locals. And I would highlight that the U.S. operations against the Islamic State in both Iraq and Syria recently actually showed a very different strategy than what the U.S. did in 2007 or 8 or 9 or 10 in Afghanistan. And that is the U.S. deployed a very small number of forces to Syria, for example, leveraged local Kurdish forces who retook territory from the Islamic State, and then we largely left. I mean, we kept a small presence, still have a small U.S. military presence in Syria, but there's been no effort to socially engineer the country. And I think if we've learned anything, I hope, and the Syria and Iraqi context highlight this, is that in cases where there does need to be, where there is a decision to use military force, in addition to other instruments of U.S. power, diplomatic, intelligence, development, information, that the U.S. needs to think very carefully about what kind of presence makes sense on the ground and how does it leverage locals to fight and in some cases die in their own countries. And so I think, you look back at the large deployments that the U.S. had both in Afghanistan and Iraq. I think in retrospect, they were mistakes. I mean, I was there during those surge periods. I think they, in retrospect, were mistakes. I think that lesson has been learned. But what I hope is also being learned from the U.S. experience this past week in Afghanistan is by simply leaving and withdrawing forces does not in and of itself solve the problem. So I think that would be a false lesson. The U.S. did this in Iraq in 2011. By 2014, we had a major resurgence of Salafi jihadists, in this case led by the Islamic State, control cities in Syria and Iraq. I fully expect, I hope I'm wrong, I fully expect a resurgence of extremist groups in Afghanistan. And I fully expect the U.S. to be back sooner rather than later to deal with a resurgence of groups much like Iraq faced. Again, I would point to a strategic level relationship that the Taliban has today with senior Al-Qaeda leaders, including Al-Qaeda leader Ayman al-Zawahiri and others that serve under him. Based on that reality, and over 10,000 foreign fighters outside of the Taliban, I expect the U.S., frankly, to be back. What I hope then the response is not flooding the country with soldiers the way that occurred in the decade or so after 9/11. So I hope that lesson has been learned. But I don't actually see the U.S.'s uh, experience and role in Afghanistan ending, even though the U.S. is withdrawing at the moment.
Well, that's not what anybody wanted to hear. So we're going to go to the audience portion of these questions. Sarah, we will go over to you.
Awesome. Thank you. This talk has been really informative and also accessible. So I really appreciate all of the really good information. And I think one thing that has been kind of seemingly a consensus from what I can tell is that the US could not stay forever. And as you said, we couldn't, continue to just flood the country with troops. But then to your point that we couldn't also just solve problems by just completely withdrawing. Would you suggest or have a policy recommendation of what the most practicable and also maybe realistic, idealistic, but maybe solution forward might have been?
Yeah, it's a great question, Sarah. I mean, I've written about this several times over the past few years. 1,000, 1,500 or so forces, uh, fixed-wing aircraft at bases like Bagram and Kandahar Airfield, and helicopters. And the goal would have been to continue to support the government, prevent the overthrow of the government by the Taliban, and continue to support political negotiations with the Taliban. I think it was clear that the Taliban did have and do have some support within the government, within the country, so that political negotiations in that sense ideally would have combined Taliban desires and objectives with those of what up until recently was the Ghani government. And then you get into a kind of a drawn out political negotiation. I think the sad issue was the peace talks were essentially dead, even though they'd been started in Doha, because the U.S. basically showed its cards immediately, and U.S. officials indicated they wanted to leave. And so if you're the Taliban negotiating, well, you just need to wait the U.S. out, because various U.S. presidents have said publicly that they wanted to go. So I would have kept a small force in, and I think this was ironically this was the recommendation that was given to President Biden. And I think it is important to recognize that the military did not support the withdrawal of all U.S. military forces from Afghanistan, did support continuing to keep a small presence, including of diplomats and intelligence officials, did support the continuing political negotiations, and the concern by senior U.S. military officials was based on U.S. intelligence assessments that a withdrawal would lead to the collapse of the government. So that's what I would have done. Would that have solved all problems in Afghanistan? No. Would it have given peace a little bit more of a chance? Yes. Would it have prevented a Taliban takeover? I think absolutely. We would not have been in the situation we were in right now, and we would have given peace negotiations more of a chance. But I think that's the route I would have taken. And note, by the way, with that size force, the costs of staying in Afghanistan were limited, very limited. Few American casualties, if any, very small amounts of money, especially compared to huge military presence that the U.S. has in Japan and South Korea and Germany and other locations. So that's what I would have suggested the U.S. Did. That's what the U.S. military suggested to the president, but that's obviously not the president chose to do in the end. So that's, Sarah, what I would have done.
We will go to Boston Globe national politics reporter James Pindell.
Hello, guys. Thanks, Justin, for this format. Thank you for coming. I'm learning so much. Three-parter, I'll be super fast and take what you want to take. I just want to learn. First, I'm surprised by what you said about Pakistan. I keep reading that they were completely freaked out by the Taliban taking over, thinking that they were next, and the refugees, as you were saying. Is that just all posturing as China was using them? Two, do you think that the Taliban is going to try to use Afghanistan to be sort of a Sunni version of Iran? Is that what's actually going to happen here, or they just have their own purposes? And third, one hopeful moderating force that I kept reading about in the lead up to this in the last year is that the Taliban needs international aid in order to actually have a functional government, and as the one moderating force that they would actually ever have. Is that relevant? Is that true? And what do you think?
All great questions, James. Thanks for them. On the Pakistan front, there's been a lot of both declassified assessments, and there's some fantastic books and articles written on Pakistan ISI's, Pakistan intelligence agencies' support to the Taliban from the 1990s to today. Probably the best single book on this is Steve Cole's Directorate S, which, as the title indicates, that's the arm of Pakistan's ISI that has supported the Taliban in its organizational structure. And so, yeah, certainly, I mean, I've spoken to senior Pakistan officials over the last few months and years, including senior ISI officials. They have absolutely been concerned about a spiraling war and what that triggers in terms of refugees that flow to Pakistan and other countries. They certainly have been concerned about spreading extremism. But at the end of the day, this is also a balance of power struggle between Pakistan and India, where Afghanistan is, in a sense, a proxy war. As multiple senior Pakistan officials have said to me, it was just unconscionable that the government in Kabul was as closely aligned to India as it was. And so for them, it was a double, what one senior ISI official told me was a double squeeze. That is, the Indians on one side of Pakistan, and then what he said, an Indian-Afghan axis on the other. So what that led to, and there's been a lot of documentation, and I can say from being at senior levels of U.S. Special Operations in Afghanistan, what our assessments were and continue to be today is that Pakistan's ISI provided sanctuary, lethal material and equipment to the Taliban, and has done that at least since the collapse of the Taliban regime in 2000. The reality is, and the evidence is, that Pakistan's ISI has provided significant assistance over the years, including today, to the Taliban. James, can you just briefly remind me the two other questions you had?
Yeah, it was. Or they try to make this to be the Sunni version of Iran, and second, international aid as a moderating force.
Yeah, so on the Sunni version of Islam, I mean, the Taliban is largely a parochial organization. It essentially runs itself as a theocracy, not unlike Iran. So there actually are similarities to the way Iran runs the government with a supreme leader. And in this case, the Taliban also has a supreme leader. It's run by largely religious leaders that support the establishment of Sharia law, although obviously the Taliban is a Sunni organization, not a Shia. But the Taliban generally don't have a lot of regional and certainly not global ambitions. And so the challenge is the domestic repression of human, including women's rights in Afghanistan, and the use of Afghan soil by organizations that cooperate with the Taliban. That brings us to groups like Al Qaeda and others. But as for having kind of a revolutionary ideology across the region or the globe. The Taliban is largely interested mostly in Afghanistan. It's groups that it cooperates with. That was the problem pre 9/11 with hosting bin Laden on Afghan soil and then refusing to give him up even after Al Qaeda was involved in the attacks. As for aid, aid is certainly a weapon that can be used, or the refusal of aid can be used against the Taliban. The Taliban will want international aid. It'll want legitimacy. It'll want recognition, including a seat at the UN Security Council. I think, though, that the Taliban was able to show in the 1990s up through 2001 that even with, by 2001, really only Pakistan providing assistance and legitimacy, the Saudis had stopped backing them and had stopped providing legitimacy and diplomatic support by 2001. They were still able to function, reasonably well. I mean, they were never a well-run government to begin with. So I think at the end of the day, if the Taliban don't get a lot of international support, it's not going to be the end of the world for them. I don't think they're going to want to compromise on core principles in how they run a government. They're not democratic, and their basic ideology. I do not think they're going to compromise on those principles. But if they can get international aid, they'll get it without without significant compromise.
We will go to Emily, and then after Emily, we will go to Dr. Terry. Emily, over to you.
Hey, thanks so much. So, I have a question about sort of the process and the exit itself. So, I'll try and be as quick as possible. So, I think it's possible to agree with the withdrawal itself, but be somewhat horrified, really, by how we left. And watching these scenes, thinking, my God, was there really no better way for us to do this? It feels a bit less like a strategic withdrawal and a lot more like we've abandoned ship and just leaving our allies in the lurch and even some citizens from what it looks like. So I'd love your perspective on our exit from an operational perspective, and what you think led us here. Like how did this happen? How did we get here?
Yeah, great and very complicated questions. There aren't entirely clear answers to that. I mean, what I would say in response, Emily, is that one can certainly support withdrawal, and the U.S. withdrew from Iraq in 2011 without this kind of almost a Saigon feel to it. The Iraqi government at that time had control over most of the cities in the country, including Al-Anbar province. And so the U.S. withdrawal had very limited very limited impact, at least compared to what we've seen in Afghanistan. The challenge, I think, was that by 2011, the war was almost virtually entirely over in Iraq. Al-Qaeda had been severely weakened by the awakening and the surge. And so the threat levels to major cities like Baghdad were just so limited. The challenge here is that the U.S. withdrew in the middle of a war where the Taliban did not control any of the major cities, but they did control districts around them. I mean, having spent a lot of time in the South, the Taliban may not have controlled Lashkar Gah or Kolat or Kandahar, but they did control some of the districts around it. So here the challenge is that withdrawing in the middle of a war, and in addition, having the U.S.'s European allies also withdraw their forces, yet the Taliban's main backers in Pakistan and Russia and China and Iran, this again, it's a mixture of diplomatic and intelligence and military, did not continue to provide assistance, change the balance of power dramatically. So, I mean, I wrote about this a year ago, that if the U.S. were to withdraw all of its forces, then it would significantly change the balance. I think, Emily, if the U.S. had withdrawn along these lines after, say, a peace agreement where both sides had agreed to start to demobilize their forces, integrate together, reach some kind of consensus on what a future Afghan government might look like, or if the Afghan government had largely won or was winning the war like the Iraqis had done in 2011, I think we would have seen a much different situation. But I think withdrawing in the middle of a war, where your adversary continues to preserve its outside support, I don't know that there were many other outcomes than what you were going to get with the way the U.S. had done it. I mean, it's certainly the case that I think it's easy to say this in hindsight, that the U.S. should have been much better prepared to get its citizens out more quickly if the timeline had gone the way of what U.S. intelligence assessments had said, a month or so, that we should have been prepared for a very rapid collapse of the government, even if it was a low probability. But that's just what our military does. It prepares for likely and unlikely scenarios. We were not prepared for the unlikely ones.
Well said. Thank you.
Thank you, Emily. We will go to Dr. Terry, who's a political science professor at McGill University. And then we will go to Haureen, who is an Afghan American citizen.
Thanks so much, Justin, and thanks, Seth, for being here. I want to go back to the Obama administration in December 2014. It seemed like one of those mission accomplished moments where, Obama talked about, drawing down forces but yeah, it seemed also like a missed opportunity. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about what happened under the Obama administration in Afghanistan and how we might have had missed opportunities.
Well, I think there were a couple of things. One is having been involved in some of those discussions myself. I mean, there was an interest by President Obama in possibly moving to what was called a zero option, as withdrawing all forces from Afghanistan. But there were similar concerns that we saw in 2021, that if the Obama administration was to withdraw all forces in Afghanistan at that time, at the end of his administration, that it would potentially lead to a collapse of the government. So Obama, I think, rightly decided to reduce the presence and increase the pressure, in a sense, on Afghan forces to get better, to get more self-reliant in the way they conducted operations, the way they fought, the way they operated in general in their government. So I think at the end of the day, President Obama and his team made the right call in not completely withdrawing. As for missed opportunities, I don't think we saw, actually, until after Obama left office, a real serious good faith effort to negotiate. I mean, ironically, that came under Trump with the appointment of Zal Khalilzad, an Afghan American, and actually quite a competent diplomat to take the lead in negotiating with the Taliban. I would have liked to have seen more of that under the Obama administration, so that it had conducted its surge, it had kept U.S. forces, but it also made a significant effort to conduct political negotiations with the Taliban, along with the Afghan government. And I just don't think, in retrospect, the Obama administration made as aggressive an effort to negotiate as they probably should have in retrospect.
Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Terry. We will go to Haureen, and then we will go to BBC reporter Gary O'Donoghue.
Thank you, Justin, and thank you, Seth Jones. Putting my Afghan hat for a moment, Afghans today, in particular, the last couple of days since the fall of Kabul, but today after President Biden's the reaction from on social media from Afghans is that they are blaming the United States, or kind of very pissed off that this is a betrayal. The U.S. has not stood with them. So I understand, and I, as a foreign policy student, that the Afghans have equal responsible. But I think I want to hear more, and if there are more Afghans in the group, or if I would be able to tell my Afghan fellows, friends in our settings, that where does the Afghan leadership, how much of the blame should they take for themselves for what happened? And I think the second part of this question is that the conditions set for, or so far that we know, is the breakup with Al-Qaeda in respecting the human rights. The U.S. could have relations, diplomatic relations with any future setup led by Taliban in Afghanistan. Is that all? Just the two, and how much is that possible happening? Thank you, and I'm done.
Thanks. Great questions. I obviously can't speak for Afghans or Afghan Americans, and I think there is a very important aspect of this discussion that does need to focus on the challenges and problems of the Afghan governments under both Hamid Karzai and Ashraf Ghani. I mean, both of whom I met on multiple occasions and got to know a bit. But both those governments were guilty of corruption, of failure to provide services to key parts of the country. There was a failure at leadership at multiple levels of the government. I do think, though, in terms of balances between the Afghan government, even under Ashraf Ghani, and the Taliban, there's a clear distinction for me. As problematic as the Afghan government was under both Ghani and Karzai, the Taliban is a much more repressive organization, also deeply corrupt, and to be very clear, has been deeply involved in the drug trade in Afghanistan. People have often pointed out Afghan government officials involved in the poppy cultivation, trafficking, production, but the Taliban has been deeply involved, probably even more so than the government. So, as problematic as the government has been, I still, when you look at the trade-off, it's a much worse outcome, I think, what we have with the fall of Kabul than what we had under notably challenging Afghan governments. And on the issue of negotiations right now with the Taliban, yeah, and we've talked a little bit about this with the carrot of foreign aid. I still think the U.S. has lost most of its actual leverage. So I don't know that there's much, and I think at this point, with a military victory that the Taliban is now established, if there's anybody that can negotiate with the Taliban and have influence, it's going to be Pakistan and probably a few other regional governments like Beijing and Moscow, not Washington or European capitals. And I think so. The reality is the negotiating power of Washington now has largely been lost in Kabul. It's not zero, but I think it's nothing like what it is for a few other governments in the region.
On that note, I want to go to BBC Chief Washington correspondent Gary O'Donoghue, and then I want to go to Fatima, another Afghan. Gary, good friend, over to you.
Thanks, Justin, and thanks for the session and incredibly informative as always. I've one thing to say and then one question to ask. One is I think this is one of the biggest intelligence failures in a number of years. And I think we'll be talking about this intelligence failure for a very, very long time. And the sheer fact that the Afghan armed forces and the Afghan political sort of structures were effectively a house of cards that fell away without any pressure on them whatsoever. That's one thing I want to say. My question is about China, and what is your view about China's strategic interest here? You mentioned that the Taliban were there meeting the foreign minister a few weeks ago. China, of course, has, albeit a tiny border with Afghanistan. What is their interest in supporting the Taliban, particularly with their Uyghur issue in the western part of the country? They don't want a kind of resurgent Islamic emirate on the doorstep that may harbour some separatists, do they? What's going on there, do you think?
Great questions. I mean, I would disagree on this being a major intelligence failure. And then I'll get briefly to China. I mean, my general assessment, talking to a range of folks, both in the U.S. intelligence community and some other Western governments and intelligence services, and then others in the U.S. government, is that U.S. national intelligence estimates, and in particular CIA assessments, concluded repeatedly that a complete withdrawal from Afghanistan, a complete military withdrawal from Afghanistan, in which the Taliban continued to have backing from Pakistan and other countries in the region, would lead to a collapse, likely lead to a collapse of the Afghan government, with one assessment recently suggesting that it could happen as quickly as a month. Now, even that turned out to be not quite accurate, because the collapse happened quicker. But what that tells me is that the intelligence community's general inclination was that a withdrawal would likely trigger a collapse of morale, not of competence or training of the forces, but a collapse of morale. And I think, in a sense, they actually got it right. So I actually don't think the primary blame here goes to intelligence predictions or intelligence analysis. I think this is a policy mistake in actually not listening to what most of the intelligence assessments actually said. On China, I mean, I think you're certainly right that China, at the end of the day, does not want an extremist neighbor. They certainly don't want extremist Uyghur groups that have an interest in operating in Xinjiang province. This is the East Turkestan Islamic movement that threaten their own Western borders. But I think what the Chinese want more broadly, and what they've indicated in several occasions, including to some conversations I've had with senior Chinese officials, is, first, they've wanted a withdrawal eventually of the U.S. They've not been particularly happy over the long run with U.S. military and intelligence assets so close to their border. So that's one, is an eventual withdrawal of the U.S. and all of its assets that they've expressed some concern that could be used against them out. Second, I think they do have an economic interest as part of the broader Belt and Road Initiative. I mean, Afghanistan does have copper mines that the Chinese government has access to. It's a little difficult to extract a lot of those resources in the middle of a war, but the Chinese do have broader economic interests. And certainly they have national security interests in preventing threats emanating out of Afghanistan to China. So in that sense, what it suggests is that a relationship with the Taliban is a means for Beijing to influence what is going on in Afghanistan. My point here, though, is that I find it very difficult to believe that any government, whether it's Beijing or Moscow or Islamabad, is going to have a lot of influence in what is going on in Kabul, in particular because uh, I think the Taliban itself is going to have a hard time controlling what's happening inside its borders in Afghanistan. The U.S. and the Afghan government were unable to control what was happening in all areas of the country, including Al Qaeda activity. The Taliban will certainly not be able to do that. Its challenges in logistics, aircraft, all of that stuff, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, is much weaker than the U.S. Is. And so I think the any of these governments, including Beijing, to influence is going to be severely limited.
We are going to go to Fatima, and I apologize if I am pronouncing your name wrong. Please do correct me. After Fatima, we will go to Ken Moriyasu, U.S. editor of Nikkei Asia. So Fatima.
Hi, Justin. Thank you so much for having me here. And thank you, Dr. Jones, for your time and your insight into all of this. We did hear a lot on the regional actors and the influences, and of course the U.S. And their involvement. I'm trying to. I guess I'm trying to see if there are promises from the Taliban to have a more inclusive governing body, and inclusive of our, internal parties of the Northern Alliance and also the Afghan diaspora, the Western technocrats, etc. And then with that idea in mind, will there be that inclusion? And will that inclusion allow for a more stable Afghanistan, where it's not penetratable by all of the other agendas out there? I would really love to hear your thoughts on that. And then, of course, I mentioned in another room the need to amplify Afghan voices, especially, the Afghans living there, and to also ponder the idea on whether or not there will be religious freedom for those in Afghanistan from minority groups such as the Afghan Hindus, the Afghan Sikhs, and of course the Hazara and Shia population. So those are a couple of thoughts I had. Dr. Jones, would love to hear your insight there, please.
Yeah, great comments. I mean, just briefly, it's certainly possible we'll see an evolution of the Taliban in the days and weeks and even months ahead. I would just say that based on the way the Taliban has ruled today, this year in 2021, last year in 2020, in areas that it controls in, say, northern or central Helmand or Nimruz, or in northern Kandahar, where frankly it's been controlling areas for well over a decade. We do see a Taliban that remains deeply conservative, that does abide by an extremist interpretation, that does repress women and more broadly human rights, that does not support democracy and allow individuals to choose their leaders, that they govern essentially by authoritarianism and brute force, and that they rule by Taliban courts. And so I think, that that all I can go on right now is how they have ruled in areas that they control. Is it possible that they will soften somewhat? Maybe. I just haven't seen it. So I would be pleasantly surprised to see a softer Taliban. I just don't see it at this point. I think we certainly have seen the Taliban evolve from only a Pashtun organization that even over the past 2 or 3 weeks, some of the key defections have been from Uzbeks and Tajiks. Not sure I've seen a lot of Hazara defect to the Taliban, but certainly some Uzbeks and Tajiks. It's probably more for survival mode than it is anything else. And there have been some local Taliban commanders, including military commanders, as well as shadow governors, or at least district governors, that have been non-Pashtuns, including in the north. But I think more broadly, the Taliban's ideology, and it did this during negotiations, even over the last year in Doha, the Taliban was not really going to compromise on most of its core principles and values, including its religious ideals. And so in that sense, I'm not going to hold my breath. Again, we could see the Taliban potentially evolve. I think it's unlikely, in part because they've now just overthrown the government and they've won militarily. I think that gives them very little incentive to moderate their views. If anything, actually, it may reinforce that the way they've been operating, thinking, acting, and ruling is justifiable. That's my worry.
We will go to Ken Moriyasu, U.S. editor of Nikkei Asia. Ken, keep it to one question if you could. And then folks like Fatima and everybody else who didn't get a chance on stage, we will go to you in the focus group for your opinions. But Ken, over to you.
Thank you, Justin. And thank you, Seth, for a really fascinating conversation. I was very struck by Biden's speech today. And I thought it was the outlining of the so-called Biden doctrine for his foreign policy. There are a few things he said. He said that the U.S. is not in Afghanistan for nation building. He said no to forever wars. He said the priority was protecting American lives. And interestingly, he said the nature of warfighting is changing. And with the new technology, America can fight over the horizon fires capabilities. And it doesn't have to have a permanent presence in the location. It can fight multiple wars with over the horizon fires. So now this sounded very different from the Bush doctrine, which of course is to spread freedom and democracy. And by having everybody become a democracy, that would lessen the risk of war. So my question to you is, if that is the Biden doctrine, if there is a situation in the Taiwan Strait, is Biden, do you think Biden is prepared to fight? Because such a confrontation in the Taiwan Strait would not be solved by over-the-horizon fires. It'll be engagement on the maritime domain. There'll be lots of deaths, and there'll be a lot of determination required. Is Biden and the American public prepared to stomach such a fight? Thank you.
I think that's a great question, Ken. I had a senior U.S. allied defense minister that I met with last week who raised this issue in a different context. And he said to me pretty categorically that watching the U.S. withdraw from Afghanistan gave him very serious concerns about the willingness of the U.S. to be a reliable ally for the foreseeable future in the Indo-Pacific area against China. So I know firsthand that the U.S. withdrawal has raised a lot of questions about U.S. reliability as a partner. Now, I would also say that I suspect some Biden administration officials would come back and say, no, but Afghanistan doesn't have major national interests. The Taiwan Straits, they do. But I think you're right to point out that that many of the Taiwan Strait scenarios would involve not over the horizon capabilities of really kind of the precision drone strikes, but would involve submarine air-sea battle, with the potential also for land warfare if there was an invasion of Taiwan itself. But I do think that if there is a Biden doctrine emerging, and it's along the lines of what you just outlined, that there are a number of countries, including in Asia, but also in Europe. I think if you're a Baltic country, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, that's sitting on the edges of the Soviet Union, of Russia right now, they're former Soviet republics, that you've also got to be questioning what this means for you, whether the U.S. will be there in case of a situation where the Russians or the Chinese threaten them. I mean, I think that's a very serious, interesting question that comes out of the U.S. withdrawal. And it's one that I think we'll see a more fruitful answer to over the next several months. The Biden administration, really over the next 4 to 5 months, will or should release its national security strategy, its national defense strategy, its force posture, which will almost certainly see a withdrawal of additional forces from the Middle East and an increase in those forces into the Asia Pacific theater and possibly into Europe. So, I think it's a little too early to tell whether this is specifically the Biden doctrine, but I think these statements, in addition to some of the strategic documents that come out, I think we'll be in a position by early 2022 to really assess what the Biden doctrine looks like. I don't think we're quite there yet.
Thank you so much.
We ask all our guests this, and whether it's on Afghanistan on its whole, U.S. policy towards Afghanistan, I really would love for you to give the audience, the 1,800 members that are with us live right now, your last thoughts on the situation, whether they are optimistic, pessimistic, or somewhere in between.
Yeah, this will be a note, I think, of some optimism, if that's the right word, is that I think if you look at the history of struggles in Afghanistan over the past 4 decades, since right around the time of the Soviet invasion, that this is not the end of the struggle in Afghanistan. The Taliban, as an oppressive regime, will trigger antibodies. It will trigger resistance. That resistance will, I think, likely take the form of military resistance to Taliban rule. I would also not be surprised at some point down the road for the U.S. to get engaged, probably in a different way than it engaged over the past 20 years. But I don't think we've seen the end of this story. And as dark as the situation is right now, and as dark as the situation may get over the next couple of weeks and months, this is not the end of the Afghan story. I think there will be a time, it's hard to predict when, but there will be a time where Afghanistan will make progress. I just think the country's going to take a step or two back at the moment. But I think there will be a time and a place. Authoritarian regimes like the one we see now in charge in Kabul create antibodies in all of the activities that they perform and the ideologies that they support. So we haven't seen the end of this.
Well, thank you for at least walking us through this depressing chapter of what is going on in Afghanistan, especially on the day that the president addressed the nation and really the world. So Dr. Jones, thank you very much for your time. We really appreciate it.
Thank you very much. And thank everybody for listening. This is a fantastic discussion, civilized, thoughtful, really, really impressive.
Well, that's all we have for you today. Again, huge thanks to Dr. Jones and CSIS for coming out, to our audience for all their incredible questions, and to you for being here. If you like or dislike what you hear, if you want to hear past episodes, find out how to join us live almost every day of the week, maybe ask one of our upcoming guests a question, please visit our website, pm101.club or pm101.live. They both work and will get you to the same place where you can find all that and more. You can also follow us on Twitter at politicsnmedia. That's politics, letter N, media, where we post regular updates as well. This has been Politics and Media 101. I'm Jeff Browning. On behalf of our co-founder Justin Higgins and our team, thank you very much for being here. We hope to see you and hear from you soon.